And welcome. My name is Carlton Smet. I'm one of the directors of ACI Group. Welcome to our first ever webinar. ACI Group have got a long history of helping our customers with distribution and supply chain challenges. And we are trying to continue to do that by adding value through different ways. One of the forums we've wanted to do it through is via this, right? We wanted to do some webinars for our customers. So we've got together a series of webinars. This is the first one. Some of them are going to be much more to do with products. We have some of our suppliers delivering some webinars coming up every month for the next 3 to 4 months, which will hopefully give you some insights into some of the ways that our products and services can help customers. It's not meant to be a sales pitch. This is all meant to be around how we add value to our clients. So at the end of this session, you will be able to sign up to other webinars and it will take you to the webinar page. So just sign up and then you'll get alerted as they come through and which products and which customers and suppliers are going to be presenting. The first one we want to do was a bit more lighthearted. We wanted to focus a little bit more on something which was hopefully going to be a bit of fun for our customers and anyone who's really interested in the food industry. So I'm really excited that we've got Dr. Annie Gray with us, who can talk about the history of cake. So Annie's one of Britain's leading food historians. She specialises in British food and dining and works as a consultant broadcaster and author. So without further ado, I'm going to invite you to kick back and enjoy the next 30 minutes with us, where we're going to let Annie take you through 500-year trip of cake history. So I'm going to hand over to Annie. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you all for having me. Today we're going to be talking about cake, something which I suspect nearly all of you have a view on, because let's face it, everybody likes a bit of cake. Apparently, the #1 cake for the British public at the moment is lemon drizzle cake. So if that's your favourite, well, good luck to you. It's quite modern, lemon drizzle cake. Very kind of outre from my point of view, looking back, as I will be, for 500 years of history. You might be asking yourself, why cake? Why food? But I would argue that food is a really good way into history. We all eat. We all have opinions about what we eat, even if we don't necessarily think we do. And so food's a really good way to get into social history, and social history really is just the history of all of us. So I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of the history of cake in Britain. And by the end of it, I hope that you will have perhaps some ideas, that you'll be inspired to go away and eat cake, and that even if you do none of those things, the next time you're there with a plate in front of you of something chocolatey and crummy and ganache, you just think to yourself, do you know what? This is a lot more interesting than I thought it would be. So to start off with, what is cake? Well, you'll be relieved to know, I suspect, that cake, the word for something edible, comes before cake, the word for things like soap or caked on in the sense of mud. So cake as a word has a really, really long history, going back to Middle English, and it probably comes from German and Old Dutch dialect words. So think about kuchen, which is still the German word for cooking, or cacao, or kak, those kind of things, which are, apart from the other meaning of them, also Scandinavian and Germanic language words for cake. But it's been used for everything. So cake can be an apple cake, meaning a solid fruit cake, so like a set jelly. Cake can be marzipan. Cake can be solid sugar. So there were things called sugar cakes in the past, which were pretty much just sort of solid icing. Even today, cake gets used for layered cakes. It gets used for cupcakes. It gets used for cheesecakes. It's really, really hard to define really what cake is, apart from nice, probably sweet, and something that we often like to give to friends. So around 1/3 of Brits in the poll of 2021, which revealed lemon drizzle cake to be the nation's favourite, around 1/3 of Brits said they like to give cake to people because it would cheer them up and it meant a special occasion to them. There are other meanings of the word cake, as in the English word cake, across the world as well. So down there on the left-hand corner, you can see le cake. Well, that is a French version of cake. And le cake is, well, it's kind of a loaf, a sort of bad sponge cake, if you like. Le cake is usually a sort of fairly nondescript sponge cake flavored with various bits and pieces. But being French, they have taken it and they have evolved it into something even more magnificent. So le cake can also be savoury. You can have it as an aperitif with olives and sun-dried tomatoes and things like that in. And I use the word magnificent advisedly, because the nation that brought us gâteau, and the nation that brought us millefeuille, and the nation that brought us all sorts of Paris-Brest, those kind of things, what they've done with le cake is a bit of a disappointment. So just be warned, if you go to France, I wouldn't recommend ordering le cake. But apart from that, everything that you see here is cake, whether it's lurid and bright, whether it's beautifully decorated, whether it's dinosaurs eating other dinosaurs on an Easter cake, or whether it's a plain, bog standard, slightly burnt raisin kind of luncheon cake. It's all there. When we think cake now, we do have a tendency to think about visuals, for which I think we have television programs to thank. So if you think cake, you may well think of something that's an amazing creation, like the one that you can see over there on the right. That is actually cake, all very much style over substance, whereas I'm kind of more on the substance style of things, really. The dictionary definition, incidentally, isn't much use when it comes to thinking about what cake is. It's really, really long. I mean, this is just a tiny, tiny extract of it, and it goes to various permutations and really doesn't come up with a lot of goods. What it does come up with, though, is a pointer towards where cake started 500 years ago, 600-700 years ago, the medieval period anyway, and that was as a portion of bread, usually with a rounded, flattened shape and often baked hard on both sides as a result of being turned during the baking process, kind of like ship's biscuit. Nothing that we would necessarily want to eat today. So here you go, field of the cloth of gold in the 1520s. Spot the cake. I'll give you a moment. Right, that's a moment. Anyone spotted the cake? I hope quite a lot of you are currently going, wow, yeah, I've got the cake, it's just there. That is a bank of ovens, and this really just points to the origins of cake as we know it. So that, you can just see it on the actual picture next to where the pictures just come up. That's a huge bank of huge ovens, and right in front you can see a table laid out with what looks like huge loaves of round bread in front. They may well be bread, but they may well also be cake, because in the medieval period and the Tudor period, cake really was a fortified bread. So if you imagine a hugely gorgeous round loaf of bread, but that's been enriched with eggs, spices, sugar, perhaps some dried fruit as well, that's cake. It's more like a hot cross bun, for example, today. So if you wanted to have a taste of the Tudor era in terms of cake, then get yourself a hot cross bun, or indeed a malt loaf. Malt loaf today tends to be raised with bicarbonate of soda, but back in the Tudor period it would have used yeast. Or you could try something like a lardy cake, which is quintessentially British. I can't imagine any other nation on earth valuing a lardy cake, but it's really easy to make. And if you wanted to sort of put yourself back in the past, all you need to do is grab yourself some plain white bread dough, spread it out as if you're making puff pastry, spread about 55 grams of lard onto that, chuck in some cinnamon, maybe some currants, a bit of sugar, book fold it, roll it, and then continue as if you're making puff pastry. So fold it and roll it a few more times, leave it to rise for about half an hour and bung it in the oven at 200 degrees. It's a sort of British Danish pastry if your Danish pastry was incredibly heavy and could probably kill a grown man, but it is really, really nice. And if you don't eat lard, you can do it with butter or with vegetable shortening, although I don't think it's quite as good. What happens next in order to make this sort of fruited loaf into cake as we know it? Well, what happens next is sugar. Now, you cannot talk about the history of sugar without talking about its darker side, and that does mean the history of exploiting other human beings. Because in order to talk about sugar, of course, we have to mention slavery. The British cake obsession in the 17th and 18th century was founded really on incredible human misery. And that doesn't just apply to sugar, it also applies to a range of other products that were grown in the Americas, but it also applies to lots of things like spices as well. Because just as the British were busy exploiting people, so too were the Dutch and the French and the Spanish and anyone who had a nascent empire in the 17th century. The British very successfully successfully ignored where their sugar was coming from, because sugar was getting cheaper and sugar was getting more plentiful. And so the advantages, it was felt, outweighed the disadvantages. Of course, it has parallels in modern day life, where a lot of people are also still able to successfully ignore the environmental impact of the food which they eat, or any other human impact that it might be having as well. Sugar, therefore, was something that was very problematic, but the movement to stop slavery didn't really take place until the late 18th century. So we have 200 years where really, if you're thinking about cake, it should be tinged with an acknowledgement that this is something that's founded on a really nasty slice of British history. Down at the bottom left there, you can see sugar being processed, and in the background you can see rows of sugar loaves, or sugar cones as they were known. Sugar was such an obsession for the British in the 17th and 18th century that the sugar cone became the emblem of the grocer's trade. So if you were going shopping in the 17th century, you would recognise your grocer not by the name hanging outside, you may well not have been able to read, but by the sign of the sugar cone, or 3 sugar cones. And if any of you are thinking, does that kind of relate to sugar cone or Sugarloaf Mountain or Sugarloaf Hill? Yes, of course it does. All of those Sugarloaf hills and mountains that you see in the landscape today are so called because at some point they resembled a sugar cone or a sugar loaf. The other thing that happened as well was that spices started to be reduced in price and also become more plentiful. And over there you can see an apothecary's shop as well. So those were all things that you could buy that were being exploited, that were being grown, that were pouring into the country, and that people really, really enjoyed. Rich people, anyway. If you were poor, you weren't going to be eating a cake at this juncture. And in the middle there, you can see a 17th century manuscript with 2 cakes on. The bottom one is orange cakes, and they are still just a sort of orange marmalade, really. So showing that cake really was a very ill-defined term, just as it still is. And the top, your gingerbread, is bread dough with ginger and loads and loads of other spices mixed in. If you do want a taste of this period of history, therefore, I would suggest you make yourself a gingerbread or a ginger biscuit, and instead of just using ginger, put in other spices too. So coriander, caraway seeds, and cloves and cinnamon, old world spices more than new world spices, because at that point things like chilies hadn't really started to take off. But cram in as many of those sweet Christmas style spices as you can think of, and then feast on your gingerbread. Perhaps dunk it into some hot chocolate or even some sweet wine to really, really get there with the 17th century. Now, cake develops in 2 main ways at that point. The first way is fruitcake. So this goes back to all those fruited loaves. And for a long, long time, fruitcake used yeast as the rising agent. So you would go to your brewer and you would buy yeast and you would bring that back and you would make it into a yeasted bread, and you would cram in more and more currants and raisins and spices as the centuries went on. These cakes were enormous. So you can see a hand, well, my hand, mixing the cake there in the middle. And that's because the first time I tried to make historic cake at home, I broke my grandmother's Kenwood food processor. So be warned, if you're going to make a historic fruit cake, make it in a massive bucket. Make sure the bucket's clean, obviously, because it's just going to save yourself cost and time and hassle and terrible things in the future. Fruitcake became known a lot of the time as plum cake, not because it had plums in, but because plum was the generic term for any form of dried fruit. So when you hear about plums being in things, plum pudding, plum cake, those things, it's always just dried fruit, except sugar plums, which are sugared almonds, but let's not even go there. So here you can see that fruitcake really was about celebration as well. So right in the middle, you've got your recipe for a plum cake. That one's from 1830. And all around it, you can see examples of cakes, both modern and indeed older. Icing was something that was applied to fruit cakes from around the middle of the 18th century, usually with a marzipan layer first, and the original icings were more like meringues. So imagine something that is quite stiff and needs to be baked after it's been applied to the cake. That then gave way to something more akin to what we'd call royal icing today, so egg whites and lots of finely ground sugar all mixed up to form a stiff paste. Of course, your sugar would need to be ground by you or by your grocer. It didn't come in neat little packets at that point. So not only was the sugar expensive, but also the time it took to make it into powdered sugar was expensive because you had to pay someone to do it. So these cakes were still things that really were something for the quite wealthy, even if not the fabulously wealthy. And fruitcake itself, you know, it takes hours to cook in the oven. A really good fruitcake, even today, will take between 4 and 9 hours if you're doing it properly. There you can see Christmas cakes, so the ones that you can see with lurid decoration. This is me just really showing off my icing and piping skills. The ones that you can see with the lurid decoration are all Christmas cakes, including the 1960s number with the candles on. In the middle there, middle right, you've got a replica of Queen Victoria's wedding cake, which was 3 meters in circumference. It was designed to feed a lot of people. And at that point, wedding cakes were not yet tiered. So the tiered cake that you can see over on the far right, that's an Edwardian cake. And it's really the Edwardian period that we have to thank for those multi-tiered wedding cakes that are more and more old-fashioned now. And then just above that is a 12th cake, which was the precursor to the Christmas cake. So fruitcake, as it developed, really did gain a sort of idea of celebration. It's christenings, it's 12th night, it's Christmas, it's weddings, it's all the things, all the life events. And it really becomes very, very, very British. It still is. If you try and feed a fruitcake to an American, they will look at you as if you are insane. Americans do make fruitcake, but it's stuffed full of sort of weirdly coloured, bright fruit, which largely turns out to be sort of some horrible random bit of pineapple or potato sometimes that's been dyed and stuffed in. And it's not nice. I did it once and everyone looked at me in a horrible way, and then it was gently pointed out to me that actually fruitcake in America is a dirty term, and you just hand your fruitcake to someone and then it's passed to someone else and passed to someone else, and so on and so forth. And I would say they're missing out, because for me, fruitcake is the best cake, and that is a hill I am prepared to die on, especially if you eat it with a bit of Wensleydale or some really good cheddar. Next type of cake, sponge cake. Sponge cake's really the root of pretty much every other cake. It first comes into being in the 17th century and is named sponge cake at the end of the 18th century, somewhere around 1800 itself. And for sponge cake to exist, not only do you need cheap sugar and access to finely ground flour and things like that, but you also need a way of raising it that isn't yeast. And that's the key thing that differentiates sponge cake from all other forms of cake at that point. The invention of the egg whisk, and more importantly, the copper egg mixing bowl, is absolutely seminal. If you whisk egg whites in a copper bowl, the proteins in the copper will react with the proteins in the egg white, and you will end up with a really stiff, really good foam. So you can whisk it up in a copper bowl very quickly, hold it over your head, and nothing will come out. And just having that stable egg foam means that you can then fold it through a cake mixture and have your cake rise in the oven. It's a miracle. It's amazing. We can make beautiful, light, feathery cakes. And really, the British in particular go mad for sponge cakes. The French are pretty into them as well, but they use them as the basis for other things and desserts. Sponge cake develops in Britain really both as a dinner dish, so often served after dinner or as part of dinner. You can see over on the right-hand side some queen cakes, which are these little delicate shaped cakes often used as an after dinner cake. It also develops as something that you can have for part of afternoon tea. And afternoon tea is really very, very much a British ritual. Comes around in the late 18th century, gets called afternoon tea in the late 19th century, and becomes something that people are very obsessed with. You also get fatless sponges. You can see the sponge cake over on the left and the one below it. They're known as Savoy cakes, and they are vast quantities of sugar and flour and eggs and no butter apart from to grease the tin. And moulded cakes like that were really popular. So if you want a taste of the 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century, I would say make yourself a really light sponge cake and then flavour it with orange flower water, which is a beautiful, delicate scent. Dancing girls apparently used to use it as their perfume behind their ears, and gentlemen would go in as for a whiff and they'd be bewitched by it. It's very nice in a cake as well. Don't use too much though. And you can then put it into a mould. So any mould will do, just not a plastic one that won't go in the oven. And then when you turn it out, it will look incredible and you can wow your friends. Sponge cakes do lend themselves to moulding really, really well. And it's why they end up as the basis for novelty cakes. So you can see the snowman in the middle, that's a 1950s riff. The ham, that is cake done in a ham mould and then stuffed with sweetmeats and then icing champagne bottles and all sorts of shenanigans going on. Or of course you can go plain and simple and just turn it into a Victoria sandwich, possibly invented or at least named by Mrs. Beeton, almost certainly not, given that she plagiarised every other recipe in her book, so probably it's not that original. Or you can go down the full novelty route and make something like a tennis cake, which you can see on the top rightish there with a net standing up. Absolutely brilliant for sharing with your friends. Everybody loves a sponge cake and it won't fill you up. Key thing though, don't waste it. There's a lot that we can learn from the past in terms of food. And of course, food waste is one of the buzz terms at the moment. And the Victorians in particular were very, very good at not wasting anything. Now, people do sometimes look aghast at the idea of leftover cake, but let's face it, a sponge cake in particular does tend to go stale quite quickly. And I think there's a strong argument for making 2 at a time anyway, precisely because some of these leftover recipes are better than the cakes themselves. So in the middle, that glass bowl is an orange fool, Boodle's orange fool from the 1930s. And all that is slices of stale Savoy cake or sponge cake soaked in cream and orange and lemon juice and sugar, and then with a little bit of grated zest on top. And it's absolutely beautiful if well chilled on a summer's afternoon. You've got the layered cake that you can see over on the right hand side with the icing on it. That's just a stale sponge cake that's been cut into layers and spread with different colours of jam and then iced, but it looks absolutely brilliant, and the jam gives it back a little bit of moisture. You can turn leftover fairy cakes into baskets. You can bake your sponge cake with custard. So sort of riff on a bread and butter pudding, sponge cake pudding, or cabinet pudding as it was often known. And of course, you can also use leftover cake for trifle. Now, I loathe trifle. I think it's probably one of the worst things the British have ever invented, because quite frankly, the idea of soaking cake in booze and then eating soggy cake makes me shudder. But if you do like trifle, and I'm sorry to say that the vast majority of people do like it, I do not, then there is a build that you can do. If you want to go full on late 19th century, then get yourself your moulded cake, because obviously you've made 2. And then you're going to put your moulded cake in a shallow bowl, and you're going to soak it in a mixture of brandy and white wine until it is absolutely the soggiest soggy cake you can think of. Not quite falling apart though. Then you're going to prick it all over with almonds, surround it with custard, and then garnish it to within an inch of its life. At that point, you'll have tipsy cake, which you can see there, and that's what it looks like in reality. So if you're going to do that, I do guarantee your friends will love you forever, and anyone who loves trifle will think it's just absolutely the best. And I will go and sit in the corner with a slice of fruitcake and some cheese. Well, the story of the 20th century, and I suppose the 21st century, is the story of democracy, both in terms of politics, and I was going to put a gag in about something political now, but it's Wednesday and you're watching this on Thursday, so for all I know, Larry the cat's in charge at the moment. So democracy in terms of politics, but also democracy in terms of foodstuffs. Cake is no exception. We democratise cake. 1875, the massive tax on sugar, which has been in place up to that point, is slashed. Sugar beet starts to be exploited rather than people. So we end up with sugar from beet rather than sugar from cane. It is chemically exactly the same thing, and of course much, much cheaper, and can be produced in Britain. We end up with cooks' cheats and shortcuts as well. So there's no need to have a maid whisk egg whites for hours and then pour them into a cake and fold them through. You can just use baking powder. I don't like baking powder. I think it makes everything taste of soap. But you can use it. You can now buy fondant icing. You can buy self-raising flour by the Edwardian period. You can buy ready to do this and ready to roll that, and it just goes on and on. You can go to tea rooms and you can sit down and have cake that's been made for you. Or by the late Victorian period, and even more so in the 1920s and 30s, you can buy mass-produced cake that's been made in a factory, packaged up and sent to your door. Absolutely everyone gets to have some cake. If you're a child of the 1980s, you will also remember the massive vogue at that point for novelty cakes that were made in home. And this is where the British cake experience really is quite unique again, because other nations go to the patisserie or to the confectioners and they buy cakes and they bring them back, and they wouldn't dream of making these things in-house. Whereas we make it a real point of pride to make novelty cakes in our homes. I remember when I was little having a book cake and a train cake and a bagpuss cake, I think, and a chocolate hedgehog cake, and I'm sure you all had similar things. Today, of course, we have the Great British Bake Off making cake slightly more scary. 60% is the figure at which Waitrose flour sales go up during the airing of the Great British Bake Off series, as everybody rushes out to buy flour and make cake. And of course it's made, re-celebritized, I suppose, Mary Berry and Sue and Mel. I haven't watched the new version, sorry, but you know, the older version, the BBC version, that was, let's face it, brilliant, and has spread as a format across the world. But we're the only people that make cake a lot on our version of the Bake Off. Everybody else does a lot of pastry and a lot of spray painting of things involving ganache. You can even go completely outre now and make cake pops made up of mashed up cake, ground up and then put up with chocolate, which is kind of like a leftover recipe, except not, because people are making cake deliberately for their cake pops. But if it does result in the heads on spikes, yes, they're Game of Thrones cakes, then I think it's okay. And because, of course, the cost of ingredients keeps on going down and down and down, well, it did. You can also buy very, very cheap mass-produced cakes in supermarkets, including in the frozen aisle, which means that truly, absolutely everyone can afford a cake. That's one I made, and I use that just to show you that even if cake has marched forward and changes have happened on the way through, there's no excuse for not having a bit of a mashup. That's an 18th century recipe for a fruit cake inside, using thoroughly 20th century fondant icing dyed with late 19th century inventions anyway, late 19th century inspired food colouring, with pastillage made from a Tudor recipe and flavoured with rose water, so very much in the spirit of the 1500s. And served up to a friend for his birthday. It is pretty solid inside, and we did obviously have cheese with the cheese cake. Anyway, that brings me to an end. I do have some questions that have been sent in that I'm going to answer in a moment, but if you have to go now, thank you for listening. Enjoy your tea and cake this afternoon or this morning or whenever you're watching this, and here's to cake, quite frankly. I do, as I mentioned, have some questions. Now, these have been submitted by various people via email. I don't have your names, but I'm going to read them out and give you a whistle-stop Q&A. So here we go. What did people use during wartime to make cakes instead of egg? Well, dried egg mainly, and it doesn't work. Cake made with dried egg is a bit sulphurous. They also tried using custard powder, which is equally rank. I've tried that as well. Or they would save up the one egg that they were allowed every couple of weeks, and then they would make cake using that. Most people didn't really make cakes. What they did instead was they made biscuits or pudding. So they still got a sweet treat, but it didn't involve eggs. 2, what is the weirdest ingredient you've ever come across or had to work with? Ambergris. Ambergris is basically whale vomit. It's not quite vomit. The whale eats all the various things that whales eat and then expels all the kind of carcasses and bits and pieces that it can't digest. Not by pooing it out, but by vomiting it out. So it's not really vomit. It's a sort of, I suppose, oral poo. Yeah, and I mean, there's no way of making it sound good, really, is there? But it's incredibly perfumed and was used, still is used occasionally, although it's banned in most countries because it's a byproduct of the whaling industry some of the time, and it's a complicated issue because it is expelled voluntarily. It is very highly perfumed and was used in the 17th and 18th centuries, more the 17th, as an ingredient, sometimes in cakes. It was said to be an aphrodisiac. Everything's an aphrodisiac in the past because it was really expensive. What did bakers use to decorate cakes in the past, and did they have icing? I think we talked about that. So it was meringue, and then it was royal icing. Piping was invented in the 1840s, fondant late 19th century, ready to roll very much 20th century. In fact, ready to roll really in the 1970s. So they did decorate things, and it was often really, really amazing. Lots of molded things as well, so decorative sugar paste models on top of cakes. What is the oldest English cake recipe? It's the breads, it's the fruited breads that we talked about, which was Henry VIII's favourite cake. Same thing, he didn't have a choice really. It's kind of gingerbread, probably made with breadcrumbs, or it's fruited, loafy, spicy cake. And Henry was a man who liked the finer things in life. So I think let's go for a fortified bready type cake with as many spices as he can cram in. He was also impotent later in life, according to Anne Boleyn anyway. So I suspect he would have put quite a lot of ambergris into his cake just to give himself a lift. 6, have you seen the British public's preferences in cake tastes change from the past to now, and what about the future? Well, we're all about buttercream at the moment and have been since the 1960s. So I would say our tastes have got sweeter, although actually we ate more sugar per capita in the 1950s than we do now. But I'd say our tastes have got sweeter and our tastes have got more infantilized. So we've gone from rich fruit cakes, punchy ginger cakes, to a lot of chocolate cakes and lots of things covered with buttercream. On the other hand, the British public's preference for lemon drizzle cake does give me hope, I think, for the future, because it's a bit punchy. And I think in the future, well, we've got to get more and more aware, really, of sustainability and of global issues. We may well see more and more eggless cakes develop, and that would be no bad thing if we can manage to still make them rise. And sadly, the rise of the buttercream seems unstoppable, and I fear for the future of the fruitcake. 7. What challenges would you have in baking a cake on the International Space Station with no gravity? It's not so much the gravity that's the problem, it's the cooking facilities and the fact that in low gravity environments you get a lot of bacteria. So most of the time on the International Space Station, things are pre-packed and then they are made unpacked and then perhaps cooked on the space station. I do a show on Radio 4 called The Kitchen Cabinet, and we do have someone on that show who worked with Heston Blumenthal and with the crew that went up to the International Space Station a few years ago. And he said it was really interesting trying to come up with stuff that would taste the same, because the lack of gravity, it affects your taste buds as well. And also because you can lose muscle mass really, really quickly in a low gravity environment. Everything has to be really nutritionally balanced. It's an incredibly scientific set of criteria. So I think the biggest challenge would be having something that tastes all right still, but can also be squeezed out of a packet and then baked in an oven and doesn't kind of lose something in the fact that it's been kept for ages and is full of preservatives. Not sure I'd want to try it, to be honest. And 8, has anyone ever died from eating too much custard tart? Not that I'm aware of. It tends to be things like a surfeit of lampreys, but I would say give it a go. See where you come out with. After all, what is life but experimentation? But, you know, maybe don't come back and haunt me if you died from eating too much custard tart. Right, that's the end of that. Thank you very much, and have a really good rest of the day, all of you.